Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Erin Kopp. I'm the Executive Director here at Bar Harbor Historical Society. Thank you all for coming today. We are pleased to present this panel between Raney Bench, the Executive Director at the MDI Historical Society, as well as Brooks Fenno, a longtime summer resident, and I think probably somebody who most of you will know. So they'll be talking about pastimes and seasonal activities during the summer. Should be a very interesting discussion today. We have Jill Goldthwait, who's going to be our interviewer today. So there'll be time, I believe, afterwards for questions. If anybody would like to, has any questions about La Rochelle or the house, please let me know, or Nikki Moser. Nikki Moser is our Director of Engagement. She's in the back there, standing by the door. So if anybody has any questions or anything, again, thank you for coming, and we'll be here after the presentation. We'll hand it off to Jill.
Thank you so much, Erin. Well, it's a delight to be here, and I said I didn't know quite as long ago as my husband did, but I knew it when it was the Seacoast Mission, and it's lovely to see it in the shape it's in now, and a real reflection of its history and an example of the many houses that served the summer families back in the day. We are fortunate to have with us two experts from different points of view. Brooks Fenno has been a long time summer resident of Bar Harbor, starting from the late 1930s, and has been here every summer except when he was in the military. And he's a winter resident in the Boston area, a graduate of Princeton University and the Harvard Business School, and an author of 4 books. The most recent one, called A Purposeful Life, about how to live a meaningful life in your 80s and 90s and beyond. Raney Bench is, as Erin said, the Executive Director of the MDI Historical Society. So Raney is working this from the history research point of view, and Brooks is working it from the I lived it out point of view. So I'm going to start with Brooks and ask us to tell you about your history as a summer person here. When did you first come? Who was in your family that came here, and where did you stay?
When I first came, I think when I was about 3 or 4, when my parents brought me up here. And that was quite an expedition to come up here in the summer with the family, because we came up in a caravan of 2 cars. And the front car was driven by our chauffeur, Walsh, and in it sat my mother. My father drove the second car on the way up, and he assisted way in the back seat of that car. I sat right between. On the one side was my brother, younger brother, and between us was my grandmother. And my grandmother's job was to keep the 2 of us kids from fighting. On the way up, to keep us amused, what we did is we were given the game of counting the cows. So, and the person that counted the most cows, my brother and myself, and my mother even, the other car was involved, got 25 cents when they got to Ellsworth. Now the 2 cars, they came up here, and invariably in the cars in those days, you got a flat tire. And so we would stop halfway up and have lunch by the side of the road. And Walsh, who was the driver of the other car, our chauffeur, he would get out, change the tires. And that was how I came up here to our house each year.
Thanks, Brooks. And Raney, how did you get involved with the history of MDI and start exploring your work? And how much of your work involves seasonal populations and pastimes?
So I moved here in 2007 to work as curator of education at the Abbey Museum. My background is federal Indian law and museum studies. And then I was there for 6 years and then moved over to the Seal Covada Museum and had my chance to be a first-time executive director of a small museum. And was there for several years. But I served on the board of the MDI Historical Society and really fell in love with island history and how many stories can be contained in this 108 square miles is really a marvel to me. So the opportunity to come to the MDI Historical Society as the executive director in 2020 was really appealing, really sort of dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's of the things that I loved and was passionate about, which is making history relevant and talking to the community about how we identify with each other in this place that we love and that we care about.
So it sounds like consideration and awareness of the summer community is not new to you when you're working life here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Key to that.
Brooks, tell us about the house where you lived when you first came here.
Well, we live in a house that's right across the way here. It's a rusticator house developed by John Calvin Stevens, who was a noted architect out of Portland. This is the only house in this island that he designed. This was in the 1930s when he became a known architect in the General Maine area. The house is rather interesting. It contains a lower first floor and an upper first floor and a main floor for the bedrooms on the second floor. Now, the second floor has a porch that looks out on the water here, and it's not almost a stone's throw from here. And this porch looks out on the water, and it had a hammock on it. As I grew up, I remember my grandfather sitting out there reading a book in the afternoon with his pipe in his mouth, looking forth as his view would allow. Also on the second floor of the bedroom, we had an elevator. The elevator still exists, but the shaft has been demolished, but the elevator still exists up there, and it goes down from the second floor to the living room on the upper first floor, goes on down to the door, the front door. So that's the elevator. In the front of the house, and I'm giving you this because this will give you an idea of what it's like in those days to live here. We had a front porch and a back porch. And the front porch was where you would have coffee in the morning that looked out in that direction there. And the back porch consisted of two parts, an inside and an outside back porch. And the inside back porch obviously was when the weather was inclement or late in the afternoon. And the outside was when it was a little bit nicer in the afternoon. Now, on the lower first floor, we had the servants' quarters. The servants' quarters consisted of a long table, which doubled as the pantry area downstairs, or the kitchen area, I should say. Out of the kitchen area up to the pantry was a dumbwaiter. So you just pull the ropes and you move the food up from the lower to the next level up. And then you, my grandmother, I remember she had a little bell on her table, on her dining room table. She'd press the little bell, and the servants would run out of the pantry, having brought the food up from the dumbwaiter, and serve it to us eating at the table. And so that was kind of the structure. And one other thing I'd add, that I think is very interesting, we had a garage. And the garage was separate from the house. And it was no small garage now. Let me tell you, it was no small garage. It was the size of a building. And in the garage were two cars. And there were enough room in that bottom of the garage so you could turn the cars around inside the garage. Now, this is kind of fun to recount. In the top floor of the garage, that was where the chauffeur lived. Now, the chauffeur was connected to our residence by a intercom phone. Every room in the house had an intercom phone, and you just press in the right numbers, and with any luck, you got that room. But Walsh had one of these phones. Now, Walsh on his 3 days off his free time off, he would go and like to fish. And he fished right out here in this water as we see it. And he would invariably catch a flounder now or two. And he'd bring the flounders back and give them to the kitchen staff to prepare for dinner. Well, of course, my grandmother was offered a flounder for dinner, but she always turned it down. And the reason she turned it down is rather interesting, because the sewage from the town of Bar Harbor. So she felt that would contaminate her if we never ate flounder.
Raney, can you give a general sense of the summer communities? Where did these people come from? How many people came? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it evolves over time and the island changes based on transportation changes. And so I think we all kind of know the common story of these first sort of seasonal arrivals coming around the 1840s and staying in the village of Soamesville in residential houses with year-round people who were living here. And the first real steamboat location where people were coming on was in Southwest Harbor. So if you think about transportation and what was available at the time, our earliest access to the world was on the outer islands through the coasting lines that would connect us between Nova Scotia and Boston and into the Caribbean even. And so as the island is settled, those are the first areas that are also settled as their access is coming in from the water. And so Southwest Harbor sees those first ferries coming in. And then sometimes people stayed in Southwest Harbor, but if you are familiar with the village, there's a Coast Guard station out now where Beal's restaurant is. And that was where the ferries terminal was. And it was also a cannery. And so that cannery had a distinctive odor to it and was not known to be very welcoming to visitors as their first impression coming onto the island. And so Deacon Clark had a large hotel there. And so he was trying to encourage tourism there, but generally speaking, people kind of had that first impression of Southwest Harbor and then moved on, taking a buckboard to Soamesville or to Bar Harbor. And then later, as Bar Harbor grew and grew, there were a second sort of division that took place between summer residents who wanted kind of a quieter experience, maybe didn't have as much of the grand hotels, and the more transient populations and visitors. And so those populations moved into Seal Harbor and Northeast Harbor and formed sort of different cultures of communities that we still see play out in activities on the island today.
So Brooks, as a person who lived through some of that, how interconnected were the summer communities? Or did people from Boston or Chicago congregate in one area and people from I don't know where else in another? How did they mix with each other when they got?
Well, we had two kind of social groups up here. The first social group was primarily here in Bar Harbor, consisted of people from Boston and people from elsewhere, most notably Chicago. That's where my grandmother came from and came here from there. The other group was from Philadelphia. They came down to Northeast Harbor, where they still exist. And the two groups were very social minded. And they decided that they would like to have tea together so they could converse. And so that's one of the reasons that Jordan Pond Tea House came into being, because it was halfway between Bar Harbor and Northeast Harbor. And you could take your cart and your chauffeur and your horse, and you could go down to have tea at the Jordan Pond Tea House. Now that grew until the Bar Harbor Club started to have dances, and that pulled the younger people over from Northeast. They started to come up here to the dances, which were every Friday night. I remember as a youngster, I would come to the dances. Of course, I was a little bit below minimum drinking age, but I always managed to have a flask with me. In case I couldn't find any attractive girls from Northeast.
So how did the Bar Harbor Club start? Was that by demand of the residents, the summer residents, or was it an entrepreneurial thing or?
Well, the Bar Harbor Club was a rather exclusive club, and it had kind of two groups of people, and it was very important that you identified with your proper group. On the left-hand side, as you walk down the area of the club towards the pool, which was a huge pool at the end, all of the summer elite people from Boston and elsewhere sat. All the townies or people who weren't as socially correct sat on the right side. So they had it divided up quite definitively, and you were not allowed to stray from one side to the other. And they had tennis courts down below, and then a huge bar up at the top of the clubhouse.
So maybe you were too young at that point to understand this, but did people from a certain city, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, did they all hang out together? Did they know each other at home, or did they know each other through the social connections here?
That's a good question. I can't exactly answer that, but they knew each other socially.
Right.
Whatever their standing was in the social register or whatever way in which they checked each other out.
So you were too young to know if when everybody went home, did they hang out with those same people?
Oh, yeah.
From here, yeah.
Yeah, the social people all hung out with the social people,
Uh-huh.
and the others didn't.
Well, I would say Bar Harbor had an incredible reputation for a period of time for being this social networked place where people were drawn together to create these relationships or build new ones. So much so, there was a whole genre of novel created called the Bar Harbor Romance. And it was a feature for a number of decades, like a dime store novel kind of thing. But all of the stories had their main characters coming here for the summer to be able to enjoy the outdoor activities and recreation. And then there's some sort of formulaic misadventure that takes place, whether the canoe runs aground on the Porcupine Islands and they are stuck overnight, or they're in the ovens and the tide rises unexpectedly and they're stuck in the ovens, or they're rocking and they get stuck overnight on the rocks. And then invariably love ensues, and the people go back to their winter communities and find this way to like come back and connect. And this was such a popular genre that writers who never even came to the island still wrote about Bar Harbor and the romance that you could find in Bar Harbor as a result of this genre of novel.
Thinking of a romance story of my own, but I'm not going to tell it. You told an interesting story to me, Brooks, about how your grandmother came to know a lot of the other summer people, that it was very important socially to be connected to all the families here. And your grandmother had a rather unique way of getting invited to the summer people's houses.
Well, it was usually the invitation came from one or the other. And I have to picture this place had these huge estates here. All the estates were enormous in size. They all had gardens, and the gardens were taken care of by a private gardener. You had your own garden, and the gardener would take care of all the rose bushes and so forth. It just was a wonderful place to visit. Well, my grandmother would hope to get a request to have tea from one of these people, who in the afternoon would invite her over for tea. They would send their chauffeur over with a small little invitation, said, "Would you come and join me for tea tomorrow?" So my grandmother would accept if she was so inclined, and she would ask if she could bring me over with her. Now, I had one interest in going. I wasn't interested in talking to the other woman, but I was interested in collecting butterflies. I had a butterfly collection, and I would run over with my grandmother and the chauffeur, and I would have my butterfly net, and I'd go off into their garden, and I'd grab as many desirable butterflies as I could, bring them home and mount them. And that was my method of getting around with my grandmother.
And your grandmother's method of getting herself around. What was the general mode of, did everybody arrive within a week or two of each other, or was it kind of spread out over the whole summer? And did people come by train in those early days, or some drove, as Brooks has said?
Yeah, so the transportation evolution as the steamboats moved out of Southwest Harbor, then there was train service that was provided between Philadelphia, Boston, and up through on the coast, and would arrive at Hancock Point, and then be able to come down on a ferry into Bar Harbor. And it was advertised that you could get on the train in Philadelphia after like around 3 p.m. and you take the overnight and be at Bar Harbor for lunch the next day. So that was really high speed. And then we also had a bridge to the island that was built as a toll bridge in 1837. And that bridge would have been primarily used, obviously, through horse-drawn carriages. The first car, we think, came across the bridge around 1899 or 1900. There was actually a car manufacturing plant on West Street here in downtown Bar Harbor from 1900 to about 1902 that produced steam cars. And then in 1903, cars were banned from the island as a result of increasing concern that cars would be a detriment to the quiet sort of summer retreat that most summer residents were looking for. And Bar Harbor banned them until 1909. And then Mount Desert banned them until 1915 when the state lifted the ban. So those, if you were traveling by car during the ban era, as you came up the coast, you had to get to the edge of Bar Harbor and you had to actually take your cars to Southwest Harbor where they would have that garages there where they would keep the car for the summer, and you could take the car off the island and go driving, or you could drive in Tremont. At the time, Southwest Harbor was part of Tremont on the quiet side of the island, but generally speaking, you couldn't drive here in town. There's all sorts of like misadventures of auto people trying to drive into Bar Harbor. And actually at the Malvern Hotel, there was this really interesting, we were talking about the Malvern earlier today. In 1907, a man on his honeymoon came and found out that he wasn't allowed to drive into Bar Harbor. And so they hitched a horse to the front of his car, tried to pull it to the Malvern. And the horse got stuck trying to pull the Cadillac to the top of this hill. So the chauffeur turned the car on to drive to the hotel, and that they were arrested at the hotel, breaking the auto law, and had to actually go to the state Supreme Court to appeal. And then the honeymooner had to pay the court fees to, that he didn't have to pay any of their fines. But it was quite a challenge for a while to balance the sort of interests of summer residents who, generally speaking, didn't want cars with year-round residents who did generally want cars, and then an increasing pressure from auto tourism that was coming for shorter daytime visits. So we have like this mix of sort of tourism that starts to come into play, more towards the 1870s, 1880s, where you have long-term summer families, as Brooks is describing, that bring staff here and have deep connections to the place and deep connections with relationships with friends and other family members and across the different villages. And then we also have shorter term people who might be here for 2 or 3 weeks staying in hotels, which had like a different relationship with the island that changed over time.
As you spoke, I couldn't help but think if you substituted cruise ship for automobile, that debate sounds very similar to what we went through here much more recently.
Absolutely.
Apparently, summer people not only retreated to Bar Harbor, but to some degree, they retreated from Bar Harbor to camps, to go canoeing, to go swimming. Tell us about the other places you went once you were situated here. What did you do for recreation and where did that take place?
Well, we had a camp that if you were to go to Town Hill, which is almost on the other side of the island, and take Indian Point Road down, you'll come across a desolate area on the right, which is all forested over. But in one of those gates was a path that was our camp area. And so I was a kid, I guess, early years, maybe 8 or 10 or so. And I had the privilege, we would drive, the thing started as follows. My grandmother would decide that the tide was good and that the weather was good, and she would decide to have a picnic lunch for the family. So she would call up Walsh and tell him to have the car ready at 10 o'clock. She would call the kitchen staff, tell them to have a boxed lunch prepared for all of us. And we would all load up and go out at 10 o'clock on this safari to the campground. Now we got to the camp area, we had quite a bit of acreage there, all wooded. And I would have the chance, the honor of being allowed to get out of the car, go and unlock the padlock in the gate and open the gate so the car could come into the pathway down to the water. And so then I would ride on the running board all the way down in the car to the camp. Now the camp was a log cabin. And you could say it had windows, but there weren't real windows. They were covered by shutters, but there was no glass or any material in them. So the first thing you did when you got there, you opened the windows or opened the blinds, let the air in. Now we had, of course, a fireplace inside of this camp, log cabin, but nobody dared light the fireplace because you might burn down the whole cabin. So I never saw that lit. But we had out back, looking over the water, we had a porch, and on the porch we had hammocks. And so I would climb into one of the hammocks as one of my first things while everybody else was putting away the stuff for cleaning up and getting ready. Then we would have lunch there. And after lunch, and this is kind of fun, we would walk down a path through the woods to the shore. And on the shores, we had all these acreage of beachfront, which today would be worth millions, but my father got rid of it because he didn't want to pay the taxes on it. But anyway, we walked down there, we would rake the seaweed away from the water so that we could get in and swim. Over the winter, Walt had put a raft out there during the spring, so we could swim out to the raft if we wanted to. But the best way to bathe there, if the tide was right, the water would come in at high tide, go through the pebbles of the beach into a little pool that we had built, a little tidal pool that we had constructed. And of course, the stones warmed up the water so that when you got into the little pool, it was a reasonable temperature in which to live. So we would go through that routine, and then after that, get changed, and we'd go to our canoe. We had a canoe hidden in the bushes. We'd pull that out, and we go out fishing in the canoe. And invariably, my grandmother would be in the canoe, my mother would be in the canoe, my brother and I would be in the canoe, and my father would be in the canoe. So they loaded up.
Yeah.
We managed to have some bait, and we would fish for mackerel. And we always would catch a mackerel, and I remember catching them, but we, of course, would be in the home. And the cooks would fix the mackerel for dinner, but I never liked mackerel because they're too oily. And so I would never eat my mackerel.
Your grandmother didn't let you anyway. I want to remind you of one other topic of outdoor recreation that you mentioned that you said was called romance. That if there wasn't anything else on the go, canoes or swimming or anything else, there was always romance when it came to outdoor recreation. Oh, my other question is there anything Walsh couldn't do? Sounds like he was a pretty instrumental player in your.
Well, I think when you have a handyman like that, you all know the value for those of you who have a house of having a handyman that can do a little of everything. And Walsh could do a little of everything.
Yeah, and well, it sounds like.
And he did a good job. And he left after, I may be ahead of time, but when he left our employ, he went to work for the telephone company as a lunch.
Did the summer residents mingle to any degree with the local people, or was it like a relationship of a person who was running a big house and needed a lot of staff? And was it a work relationship, or were there personal friendships, or how did that work?
Well, you'd be better positioned with your husband to answer that question because he was a banker. I think that the relationship that I saw was pretty much the summer people, the elite summer people, would mingle among themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, they didn't intersperse their activities with the townspeople in particular.
Mm-hmm. Although they certainly depended on them
So
for.
they depended.
Yeah.
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 But it's a very functional relationship.
Right. Did any summer people convert to year-round people and stay here all year?
We have very extensive multi-generational summer families who have roots that are year-round here on the island, absolutely.
But now there are.
Yeah, and that their families have been here since the 1880s in some situations. Think of the Elliots specifically, Charles Elliott and their family have continued to stay here and grow and will have summer family extensions and year-round family extensions. And there's others as well, Wilkins and several others that you can think of that have been here for a really long time. And I think, it's interesting when we think about summer pastimes and the relationships between summer and year-round residents, there were certainly areas where we see crossover, and a lot of that could be in outdoor recreation or in sport. So I think about that with sailing, that we do see that there were year-round residents who were really active in sailing, and that we see those close connections that linger between those different populations, and other forms of sort of island sport that might allow people to mix. There's a lot of gender mixing too. And part of
Now
what
we're back to romance.
yeah,
Outdoor.
but part of what drew people to MDI versus Newport or Niagara or some of the other places that summer residents had large populations is that this was a more casual experience where women especially could be outdoors. They could be canoeing and hiking and buckboarding and sailing and doing things that they might not have done in their social spheres in other places. And so it allowed them to show their strength, their independence, their intelligence, and then romance blossoms from that, as we've mentioned before. But it like culturally it was a place that people sought out a different kind of experience that was more connected to the outdoors. And Brooke's story of the camp on Indian Point, I know several families who have long-term summer connections here who also have histories of camps on the quiet side or on the western side of the island. And so that was another form of just connecting to this place outside of the social aspect of it, or what we think of sort of high culture, but really wanting to know MDI as a beautiful location in its own right.
And I think anecdotally, what I've heard is that more of the younger generations who may not have been as class conscious as their parents and families were, there were local kids here that mixed it up with the summer kids. And some of those summer kids stayed on and lived here and raised families here.
Now it's all sort of melded together,
Yeah.
but it wasn't at that time.
Yeah. So we could not have been friends back then. You mentioned a hotel earlier, and I wondered if you'd say more about it, because some people who came didn't have a house. They lived in some pretty large hotels, and the Malvern was one that you knew a bit about.
Well, the Malvern Hotel was right up a couple of blocks from here. Unfortunately, got destroyed in the fire. But just picture this hotel with these tall pillars in the front of the hotel, with an area where the gentlemen in their straw hats could sit outside, smoking their pipe and their vests on, and entertaining the ladies with gowns, and just having a wonderful time here with their staff upstairs taking care of them. Now, my grandfather came from Chicago. He brought his whole staff with him, and they all spent the summer here, taking care of him in 3 or 4 rooms of the house, of the hotel. So it was a real kind of a rooming house for wealthy people.
The rumor, as I heard it too, was that in our house, which was built as a summer house, there wasn't even a kitchen when it was first built. Everybody went and took their meals at the hotel, so nobody needed a kitchen in their house, which is a little bit hard for me to picture when I like my morning coffee, but.
Yeah, we know from some, it's interesting, I think, as a result of, in part because of the fire, or maybe because the sort of ephemera, we don't think about it as being worth keeping, but recently we had an author working with the MDI Historical Society looking for venues from some of these historic hotels. And we reached out to our peers, including here at the Bar Harbor Historical Society. There's very little information on the historic hotels in any of our collections on the island. And that was sort of an eye-opener. I think we maybe all, I'm speaking a little bit for Aaron here, but we all sort of assumed that we had it. And then when we went to look for it, it's not here. And so we are receiving the business records of the Kimball House from Northeast Harbor at ours, at the MDI Historical Society. And I'm excited to be able to see things like the information related to food production and purchasing and chefs. And in that situation, I think was not unique. They had the main hotel, which you had your rooms and you stayed in, as Brooks was sort of mentioning. But you also, the Kimball also had a series of cottages that they rented out for families. And the condition was the families didn't eat in the cottages. They had to get room, or they had to get board, excuse me, through the hotel. And so that could be delivered to the house to be able to eat at the dining room in the house you rented, but it was all provided through the kitchens of the Kimball House. And so I think that that was absolutely part of the culture of providing service to the hotel guests who were here for sometimes long periods of time and sometimes shorter.
And I assume most of you, if not all of you, know something of the history of this house, that it was owned by a Summer family who lived here. And a dear friend of ours, actually, Tris Polkett, grew up here, and it was really fun to bring Tris here when the house had been kind of restored as it is now, and see him go through these rooms and look at the places that he lived. And the word was that his and my husband's height were marked on the kitchen wall behind the kitchen door. I'm sure that's long painted over, but the history of this that sounds so kind of remote really isn't that far away from the local culture here. And if you go by the fire department in Bar Harbor, you'll see a flagpole out front and a stone in front of that. It says Tris Polkett, benefactor, firefighter. He was both of those, and he meant a lot to this community. He was a wonderful person. What do you think people from away gained by being here and the locals gained by having them? And I'm not really talking about the economic benefit now. Were there other benefits to either community from being here in the summer?
I would credit the summer community with really popularizing a conservation and land preservation ethic that we really all benefit from today. When you look back historically, MDI was first settled by year-round residents, not Wabanaki people, in the 1700s with small farms and sheep, and they were logging. And so the primary export coming off of MDI was dried fish and lumber. But as we started to see advances, both first of all in demand from increased lumber going into the Caribbean and plantations to support slaveholding plantations with building materials and firewood, then you see these really large-scale logging efforts taking place. And then in the 1880s, the portable sawmill is invented, and it transformed our ability to deforest our area. And so there was a point where MDI was almost completely devoid of trees, because the sawmill was, rather than like cutting trees that were ideal and taking them to the mill, which was an effort, you could bring the mill to the forest and just cut anything. And so when we look at these early guidebooks from the 1880s that are talking about MDI is great, however, if you are hiking or you get off the trail even a little bit, you see that the forest is completely gone. And the first real calls for conservation start almost immediately in 1880 with the Champlain Society, a group of students who were here from Harvard every summer for 10 years. And they're saying, can't we do something to create some way of preserving what's left, but also buying up land that's been damaged or logged and preserving it to allow it to reforest and regenerate growth and keep that in the public interest. And that's the call for action that ends up being answered by George Dorr and Charles W. Eliot and forming the trustees that end up forming the park. But it really comes from this concern of summer people coming up and seeing the destruction of a landscape that's really important to them. Now, the other side of that coin is they didn't understand the economic reliance that the year-round residents needed by logging. And so then that starts to switch to tourism, and we don't want to get to the economic piece, I agree, but culturally, like, I really think about that, that appreciation for nature that brought summer residents to MDI instead of Newport or instead of, you know, Niagara or wherever else they went, is why the island looks the way it does today with so many natural spaces available to the public.
I'd like to mention one thing, industry here that has been overlooked, the granite industry.
Yes.
The granite quarrying was a big factor in the early 1900s.
Absolutely.
But I think that I'd approach this answer to that in a different way. I would say that this island has a certain magnetism to it. It pulls, it has a power that brings people here from all kinds of walks of life. From concert pianists, we had one just recently who was a guest here, to retired military people, to writers, you name it. There's a certain pulse that this island creates that brings all kinds of people here. And these people often stay here permanently.
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that, and it makes me think about one thing I've been fascinated with is that there is this connection between Washington, D.C. and ambassadorial offices. And so at one point before World War I, MDI in July had more ambassadors and foreign dignitaries that stayed here than they did in Washington, D.C., which is remarkable. And it is this drive, and to this day, we still have a really significant foreign dignitary population that summers and year-round residents here. And I think it's part of that same, I love that term, this magnetism of this island that draws people here and keeps them here.
Brooks, I'm gonna give you the last word before we go to some questions, but did we miss any of your favorite memories that you have about just in general being on MDI?
Well, I have one, this is a kind of fun one. This took place during World War II. And in the evenings, my father and grandfather would be out on the porch listening to the radio. That time, of course, there was no television. Listening to the radio, talk about the invasion of Europe by the Allies and fighting the Germans to the end of the war. And I was had a governess at the time, and my governess would dress me up in what amounted to lederhosen. Went over my top and a white shirt, and I would get paraded in to see my grandfather and father, who I hadn't seen all day. And I would go in there for half an hour while they were listening to the radio, and so I would listen to it too. And then my governess would take me out to the kitchen to feed me dinner. And that was something I'll never forget.
What questions do any of you have? Would you like to hear more about?
Well, I think the fire of 1947 was a period where it was questionable whether Bomber was going to exist.
Yeah, we kind of took that as our stopping point.
Yeah.
And
But that's because I started coming here after the fire. And it was by that point, at the Bar Harbor, there was no difference between somebody who was a summer person or somebody who, was the son of a lawyer who worked in Buffalo. So that part of it was different for me than, with somebody who had been here before the fire. I think the fire was sort of an equalizer, but, and that also prompted the growth of Northern Park and Field Park because, people wanted, by that point, wanted it, I thought, a little bit more simple. But it's survived through many, many periods, and it will survive for that much longer, but I thank Rose because it's a walk down memory lane.
You're a great example of somebody who has tiptoed her way into really being part of the year-round community.
This house that, if Chris was here, Sheldon wasn't with her. They were best friends.
Yes,
And that stuck to the extent. So that it really, there are a lot of memories because Chris's sister was my closest friend and still is. And I can, sort of like, the things that we would do that were sort of naughty, but.
You should be in this.
Yeah.
I think there was a question back here as well.
Fire here during the fire, or were you gone at that point?
What had your family was not here then, right?
I was 13 years old at the time of the fire. And the fire was October 1997. And 47, sorry. And the fire took place on October 17th and started. It lasted through October 23rd. And I remember when we were in Boston, having closed our house because we don't have winter heating. We were in Boston with no idea whether our house had burned down or not. And it wasn't for a week later that we had found a minister who had come by and said, your house is still standing, but you've lost your garage. And so we came back up to see the house and see what had happened. And yes, there was no garage there, but the house was standing. The fence next to our house had burned through the base, and it sat literally that far from the house. The house stucco, and the wind had changed and moved off and taken the Malvern Hotel with it. Now I stood there. I'll never forget this. Age 13. I'm standing there. I'm looking to the southwest, the southeast. I'm looking to the south. I'm looking to the southwest. All demolished. Everything was burned down. All these lovely houses and the gardens and everything was gone except for one house. There was one house there, and that house is still there today. And that's the Collier house. And the gardener had bravely stood on the roof during the fire with a hose and hosed that house down while all the surrounding area burned down and the house was safe. And that is what I remember about the fire.
Betsy.
So it's interesting to like think about the fire as you think about, I mean, we know that it's changed the park, we know it's culturally created a lot of shifts. I agree with you that there was huge cultural change that took place on the island. But just as you walk around Bar Harbor, if you understand what you're looking at and use the lens of the fire to think about neighborhoods, all of a sudden you can start to see where those fire lines were. So you can stand at certain corners, and if you look towards the water, it's all historic houses and historic hotels. Yeah, yes. And then if you look the other way, where like the Melbourne Belmont is now, it's all modern and because that's the fire line. And so, so it's just like an interesting lens to use as you look around town, in the future, to think about like, why does the town look the way it does now? Why are there these old beautiful buildings over here and they're not over here? And that's part of the reason.
I would say also that the fire changed the landscape because the people who had these big houses, they couldn't afford, number one, following the crash, to rebuild the houses. And number two, they couldn't find the help anymore to staff the house. So they didn't come back. And that created an opportunity for visitors to come in from all over. And that's what you see today.
I know, I was not here at the time of the fire, but my husband and family were, and he and his brother and mother and some friends went by boat, small boat, off to Cranberry Island where they had a house. And his father stayed to help with the firefighting, but they escaped, if you will, to Cranberry Island and waited out the first few days out there.
I'd like to add one other thing about the fire itself. It started down in Halls Cove area on Crooked Road. There was a dump, and the dump was burning the rubbish that had come accumulated through the summer. And then the wind came and it got out of control. Now there were 3 fire hydrants between Bar Harbor and Halls Cove, 3 fire hydrants. Of course, the minute the fire started to spread, all the fire departments, Northeast Harbor, Ellsworth, Brewer, etc., were all called into play to come and fight the fire. But they all arrived in their fire trucks, but the houses would not fit on any of those 3 fire hydrants. So they couldn't use those fire hydrants at all, because every town had its own configuration of fire hydrant.
Yes.
I just want to say how much I love this session and this museum. And if one of you could sort of point out room by room, for instance, to our left is the dining room, the some remnants from some of the hotels. And I love this one with the story about the ship loaded with gold that had to stay here in Bar Harbor. And the children's room and the magic experience. Garden room, and then upstairs, I understand that the math room, men just absolutely stay in there by the hours. And the thing that impressed me the most, because I had no idea about it, was the milk industry on the island. And some of the families, I understand, like the milk produced here on this island, that when they returned to New York, they made arrangements for milk to be sent all winter long down to New York from Third Island. So I love this museum, and I think you all have done a fabulous job, but you can probably tell better than I have about what's in each room. Really intriguing, and thank you.
Nikki, do you want to speak to when the museum's open or when people can come in for a tour? You're probably in your transition phase, is why you're hesitating.
Well, there are 3 floors exhibits. We've expanded from probably what you've seen on the 2nd floor. We have a fantastic exhibit that won't be here next year called Fashion to Die For, curated by Holly Jacobs Evans, our style volunteer who is amazing. We have a great exhibit about Claire Spence and Charlotte Baker, who built the willow. Around the corner, you can't see her at the bottom of the ocean side. We also have a room that kind of has a lot to do with this talk. And it's called Belonging, Fraternal Orders and Social Clubs, and it highlights, again, part of our textile collection, but that story about how people here self-sorted into social groups and how that happened and how that evolved. So we welcome you to come and visit the museum every day of the road. Over here.
Yeah, well, I would have called on Erin, but she looks busy. Thank you very much. Yes.
Theater and those kinds of entertainments.
Now or in back in the day of the summer people? Yeah. Brooks, do you remember, you were too young to be interested in culture, but did you? Did you?
I was in one band.
So do you have any recollections of musical performances or theater or anything like that?
Well, of course, the Criterion used to be quite the theater here. That was the center of town. And that was, they have refurbished that comfortably from what it used to be. So I remember that. I remember they used to have the music festival here. And that used to be held down. We attended a number of their functions. Those were the two in particular.
Mhm.
But there are a lot of other cultural functions that took place. Yeah.
How about now, Randy?
I mean, well, now there's, oh my gosh, like every weekend.
Sometimes never too late.
And John Green, absolutely. But no, we know that there were, as you mentioned, concert conductors that were here, the Dan Rush.
There's
cars-
still are.
Yeah, there still are. And traveling musicians, we had the Palace of Fine Arts that was down by Kibo, which hosted art exhibits, plays, musicals, dances. There were early film productions that we don't know that much about that we know were taking place on the island, up to even Stephen King films that were done here in Southwest Harbor. The Storm of the Century was filmed in Southwest Harbor in the 80s or 90s. Better House Rule was filmed there. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so there's the long legacy of the arts that are tied to not just to the outdoor experiences here, but for that as well. The Jessup actually had a print room that they had exhibitions in their own collection for a period of time. That was part of the original formation of the Jessup Library's collection. So those kinds of activities were common here throughout the summer months.
And one lovely way to get involved with all of the community of the arts here is to offer housing for any of the artists who are visiting. And we've had the great joy of some truly world-class musicians stay with us in the summer. Francis Fortier, who started the music festival, used to stay at our place when he came up. And I remember Jeffrey Ellenberger, a master violinist, playing Happy Birthday to Our Son on our porch with his violin. Some very nice mixing of these kinds of things. Other questions? Everybody's thinking supper, yes.
So that's works to human segregation to the criteria. Where the summer people set up, stay adults, local adults sat in the middle. And the high school was set on one side and the grade school was set on the other.
Really?
Yeah. Works best if it's sit in balcony.
Well, still is.
Well, in the winter, that makes sense because it's warm, but in the summer.
No, remember that. That's something we didn't know it existed.
Last question. It's been absolutely, I'm gonna stand up so I can see you all. It's been absolutely wonderful having so many people turn out. The grayer it got outside, I thought, oh, this isn't gonna work. But here you all are, and we really appreciate your coming. Thank you very much to our hosts here at the Bar Harbor Historical Society, to Raney from the MDI Historical Society, to Brooks, who lived all of that experience.
I
And
was still here.
you-